Alright, so we're going to go ahead and begin the assembly of the F-22 Raptor by AF Model. So the first thing that we're going to do is install the nose of the aircraft. Now when your accessory bags, you're going to look for the bag that says front fuselage, fixed screws. And then what we're going to do is install the M4 by 50 millimeter bolts that's going to be in the top. And then we're going to flip the jet over, and then we're going to install the 3 millimeter by 10 millimeter screw that's going to be bolted down from the bottom. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. Alright, so now that we got the nose section bolted down from the top, we're going to flip the jet over so that we can install the M3 by 10 millimeter screw that's going to go from the bottom. In able to do that, we're going to need to bring the landing gears down so that we have access to that that spot where the screw is going to go. Alright, so at the moment I just installed the wings so that we have the connectors plugged in, so we have power to the landing gear door servo. So what we're going to do now is power up the aircraft, and we're going to cycle the landing gears 2 complete full cycles. So we're going to extend the retracts and then wait a few seconds, and then we're going to bring the landing gears back up, wait a few seconds, and then do it again for the second time. So what that's going to do is allow the landing gear door covers to basically register the endpoints of when the gears are up and when the gears are down, so that it knows where the endpoints are for the servos on the gear doors. So we're going to go ahead and power on the aircraft now. Alright, and we're going to cycle the landing gears. We're just going to let that sit. Then we're going to bring the gear back up. Alright, keep that door closed. Gear back down. Awesome. Alright, so now that we have the landing gears down, I can go ahead and flip the jet over so that I can put on the final screw for the nose section of the jet. So I'm going to go ahead and power this plane down so we can flip it over. Alright, so I know I didn't get a chance to show you guys during the unboxing with the landing gears. So here is the main landing gear on the F-22 Raptor. So those are actually JP Hobby brakes that are installed, and these are actual rubber tires with ball bearings on the axles, and then your main landing gears are actually painted white. Alright, so then at the nose of the aircraft, same thing. You've got ball bearing axles with rubber tires. They are not plastic foam tires, the cheap ones that other F-22 Raptors have installed. So these are actually aluminum hubs, rubber tires, and then you got full suspension struts. And then you've got a LED landing gear lights installed. So now that we have the landing gears open, the last screw that we need to install is going to go right into that spot right there. And I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Alright, so the next thing that we're going to do is install that M3 by 10 millimeter wood screw. So we're just going to drive it into that spot where I pointed out earlier. Now you don't want to over tighten these screws because they are metal on plastic, so just hand tighten and that will do the job. Alright, so that is pretty much snug. Now I am going to bounce around a little bit with this build because I will go my traditional route of when I build turbine jets. So the first thing that I'm going to do before I even do anything with electronics is I'm going to flip this jet over and pull out the fuel tank, double check the fuel plumbing to make sure everything is set up correctly, and then we're going to move on to the next section. Alright, so now that we got the fuel tank removed, essentially what I had to do was remove the component tray and then pull the top section of the fuel tank out first, and then the bottom tank comes out. Now, for those of you who are familiar with building jets, this is not your first time building this. You can go ahead and just bypass this portion. but for those of you who are new to turbine jets and this is going to be your first turbine jets, this step is one of the most important part of your build. And if you do it the first time and do it right, you shouldn't have any issues with your fuel system and your turbine not shutting off on you while you're flying because of an improper setup of your fuel system. And that is very crucial. So essentially what I am looking for, I've already unloosened the fuel tank fitting, but what I'm looking for is to make sure that the clunk actually hits the bottom corners of the fuel tank. Now the second thing that I look for is what is the fuel plumbing assembly look like. So looking at this, pulling it out, it is actually a pretty decent setup. Now the only issue that I have with this kind of setup is that there is no brass pipe in between the section of the main pickup line. And the reason why I would put a brass tubing in between the main pickup line is that as you're flying and you're doing maneuvers, sometimes the fuel clunk will actually bend up and will get stuck in this position just like this. I'm going to hold the tank up. So imagine you're flying around and your clunk's swinging around the bottom of the fuel tank, and then somehow it bends itself up and gets stuck in the forward position while all of your fuel is on the back of the tank. Now your fuel clunk is in the forward section of the tank sucking in air. And that's going to be a problem. By adding a brass tubing in the middle section of the main pickup line will prevent that main pickup line from bending on itself and not returning back to the back section of the tank. So what I'm going to do now is make a cut in the middle of the main pickup line, insert a brass tubing. We're going to safety wire it, and that's going to pretty much wrap up the main pickup line on the main tank. And then also what I noticed on the smaller tank that goes below the main tank is that the main line is actually way too long, because if you can see, the clunk is basically stuck at that corner. So if I had not pulled this tank out and verified the fuel plumbing, this could have potentially gave me issues later on in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that issue with the smaller tank, add a brass fitting or a brass tubing on the main pickup line on the main tank, and then we're going to put this fuel tank back in place. Alright, so just a quick update with the tank fitting. So I pretty much have re-plumbed up the smaller tank. This is the 300cc one that goes on the bottom. So now it actually freely moves around to the bottom of the tank. So that's pretty good. And then also another thing I did is that I use safety wire, double wrap on all of the fittings. Now I highly encourage you guys to put safety wire on every single one of the fittings. I haven't put one on this one yet, but I will when I'm done. And that's just to make sure that you don't have any fuel lines that are going to come loose while you're flying. Also take note that do not use zip tie as a source or a way to secure your fittings. Zip tie just does not do a proper job with completely sealing all the way around on the fittings. It'll actually pinch one side of it and then allow air to get sucked in, and then now you have issues with your fuel lines. So I wanted to show you guys what I did with the main tank. Like I mentioned earlier, I did cut the fuel line in half and then installed a brass tubing in between. And what that's going to do is allow the fuel line to still be able to move around to the bottom of the fuel tank, but it will not allow the fuel clunk to basically bend on itself and get stuck forward of the tank. So I am now going to finalize the assembly of the fuel tank by putting all this back together and install it back in the F-22. Alright, so now that we got the main fuel tanks back inside the F-22, the next thing to deal with is this factory UAT. I am going to do an upgrade on this F-22, so I am not going to be using the factory UAT, and then instead I'm going to be installing an Inarco iTrap 40, which I have been using on a lot of my builds in the past, and has been performing very, very well and had not had any issues at all with this UAT. So I'm going to be installing one on this F-22, and I'll show you guys how it looks when I'm done. Alright, so now that we've got the UAT installed and all of the fuel plumbing is back in place, I did, like I mentioned, safety wire on every single connector. Here is our fill line. So basically The fuel plumbing is complete for the F-22. The last thing we need to do now is finish up the plumbing leading to the back. So we've got our 3mm fuel line right here that is going to go to the back of the jet, where we are going to now install the Swim 80 on this F-22 Raptor. Okay, so now we are at the tail section of the F-22 Raptor. We are looking at the turbine compartment of this jet. So I'm going to zoom you guys in a little bit, hopefully that you can see it. But if you look at the turbine rail, you already have pre-drilled holes for this Swim 180 on this jet. So it is as simple as taking your turbine, lining up the holes with the turbine mount, and then screwing it down. So what I am going to end up having to do probably is to put a wood former down here somewhere on the bottom of the compartment forward, and then we are going to install an on and off valve and then the fuel filter so that we can attach the 4mm fuel tubing into the intake side of the turbine, and then we're going to be complete with the turbine installation of the F-22. Alright, so turbine is now installed in the F-22. We're going to now move on to installing the fuel filter and the on and off valve that is going to be mounted back here. So I think this is where we're going to go. We'll just probably mount it down here on the base of the intake, and then install the fuel line. Alright, so I just wanted to show you guys how it looks like under the component tray. So once you take the component tray off, you have all of these wires that are pre-labeled from the factory. I did install the junction box that comes with the kit. So I have the ailerons, the rudder, and the flaps all plugged into the junction box, and then you just have a single lead now for that channel. So you save some channels on your receiver with that setup. The only thing that I'm not plugging on the junction box is the elevator. I'm going to be using a power box micro match, and what all this does is basically servo matching. So I can fine tune the deflection on both sides of the elevators using this micro match to get some servo matching, because the junction box doesn't give you that option. Essentially it's just a giant Y harness. Back here I have the leads for the retracts. I just kind of bundled them up together, and then these two are my brakes. Now one thing I forgot to mention during the installation of the fuel tank is that make sure when you have the fuel tanks out, when you guys inspect it, run your lead to the turbine and tuck it in under the fuel tank. I actually ended up having to take the fuel tank back out just so I can install the or feed the wire for the signal for the turbine. So make sure you guys do that first before putting the tank back in. The kit does come with the EBEC, and basically all of this is it's a EBEC with 2 power leads, so you can plug in a 2 to 6 cell LiPo, and you have 2 independent inputs and outputs. So one side's going to be for the servos, and then the opposite end, which is already pretty much bundled up and plugged in, is going to be powering the retracts and the brakes. I am going to be using two cell lithium ion packs, 3000 milliamps. I like using those smaller packs because it's just easier to install, especially when you don't have a whole lot of space. Lithium ion packs saves me the headache of trying to figure out where to tuck this, large LiPo packs. So basically, I'm going to just finalize the cleanup of these wires, and then we're going to install the top component tray, and I'll show you guys how that looks right now and how I have it set up. So I have the retract controller basically where it was installed from the factory. I mounted the fuel pump for the turbine on the right side towards the rear, and then an on and off valve. So once I have this installed, I'm going to put the receiver here, and then the 2 lithium ion receiver packs are going to go up forward of the tray. A quick little upgrade that I did to it is that I added these wood blocks, because I noticed that there was only 4 screws that holds the component tray in place, and the front part of the component tray was flexing. So if I'm going to install lithium-ion packs up here, I want it to be properly secured. So adding these blocks up front now gave me the option to be able to, so you just tuck this in here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. So now I'm able to mount the screws from, initially from the factory, the 4 in the back, and then I can also install the 2 screws up forward. So now that eliminated the flex up forward, so then I can install the 2 receiver packs up here, and then my receiver right here in the center. So I'm gonna finalize the turbine installation because I still have one more thing that I haven't done yet, which is installing the fuel filter on the 4mm Festool line, and then we're gonna feed it back to the turbine so that finalizes the turbine installation. So I'm gonna finish that up and then show you guys how the component tray is gonna look once I'm done installing everything. Alright, so pretty much the next step is to go through your hardware bags. So you've got a bag that's labeled aileron and then another bag that is labeled flaps. So pretty much just retrieve the push rod with the ball link installed, 2 of the bolts, 2 lock nuts, and 2 of the washers. So for the aileron installation on the servo arm, it's going to be on the outermost hole. So we're just going to set this up really quick and then just hand tighten it for now, and then we'll finalize it later once we have everything set up. And then on the control arm itself, for the control surface, we're going to go on the outermost hole as well. Now with the installation on the flaps on the control arm on the servo, we're going to go on to the second hole. So it'll be the middle hole on the servo arm. Alright, so now that we've got both of the control arms installed on the flaps and the aileron on this wing, I'm gonna go ahead and get started with the other wing, and then move on to the next step of the assembly, which is the installation of the horizontal stabilizers. Alright, so the next step now is to install the horizontal stabilizer. I've already went ahead and installed the right side. So for the installation of your horizontal stabs, you're basically going to remove the included stainless steel bolt that's already on the rotating pin. We're just going to unloosen this. Try not to drop it, and then we're just going to slide it into pivot point here. Alright. And then we're just going to take our bolt and then go from the underside and just basically screw it in place. But before I do that, I'm going to put some blue Loctite on this bolt so that way it doesn't back out during flight. Alright, so here's kind of just a zoomed in close-up look of how the setup is on the elevator. So basically what we did was we installed the stainless steel bolt that screws in from the inside, and that prevents the horizontal stabs from coming out. So the next step now is to just basically install the control rods on the elevator. So we'll do that next. Alright, so the next step now is to install the push rod on the elevator. So we're going to go ahead and retrieve our bag that says elevator on there. And then you've got two sets of push rods with carbon fiber sleeves in there, and then the appropriate hardware. So the installation for the elevator is going to be on the second hole, or the middle hole, on the aluminum control arm on the servo, and then attach it to the horizontal stabilizer. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Alright, so quick update. I flipped the jet upside down so that I could show you guys what I'm talking about. Initially, I had the push rods mounted on the outboard of the control arms on the servo, and then what I found was that up elevator deflection, the push rod was actually binding up against the bottom of the control surface. So it doesn't specify that on the manual, so just kind of one of those things, you know. Now I know. I learned to put the control rods on the inboard, not the outboard side of the control rod or the control arm on the servo. So save you guys that headache, install it on the inboard side. Alright, so next step now, I'm just going to go ahead and do this before I install the vertical stabilizer, and that is to install the hardware for the push rod. So basically we're just going to install the push rod per the manual. We're going to install it on the outermost hole on the servo arm, and then the outermost hole on the control surface. So I'm going to go ahead and install these push rods first before we bolt it down to the fuselage. Alright, so we've got the control rods mounted on both sides of the rudder. The next step now is to retrieve your bag that says rudder fix screws. So you got your M3x20 and M3x25. So let's go ahead and install these vertical stabilizers now. Alright, so I already got the right side of the horizontal stab installed. I haven't installed the left side yet because I wanted to show you guys. So you basically fish out your servo lead, and we're going to plug it in. So notice how you have quite a bit of compartment right there to tuck all these wires through, so that is out of the way when you guys install your wires. Alright, so we got a good connection there. Polarities are correct. So then now we're just going to try to tuck all these wires into that little compartment so it is out of the way and doesn't get smashed. Alright. That takes a little bit of just wiggling it in place. Try not to force it in there if it's not going in. Now the next step to do now is to retrieve your M3x25 and 20 millimeter bolts. So the 25 millimeter goes on the forward section, and then the 20 goes on the aft section. So once I have this bolted down, I'll show you guys where those screws are going to be, where those holes are located under the fuselage. Alright, so the F-22 is almost complete with the assembly. The next thing to do now is to just install the wings. So I've already installed, and I'll pull it out, the carbon wing spar that is included with the kit. So you basically just install that, and then you got another set of shorter wing spars that's going to go on the aft section of the fuselage. You actually have two of these, one on each side. So then you just basically slide your wings in place. Now it won't be a bad idea, honestly, to, if you wanted to, just permanently glue the second wing spar in the fuselage just like that, so that way you only have to deal with just that main wing spar on the leading edge section. So we're just going to go ahead and just plug these wings in place. Alright guys, the assembly of the new AF Model F-22 Raptor is nearly complete. So we've already done a lot of the assembly of this jet. The last thing left to do now is programming our control throws and doing our CG. So let's go ahead and get started with that portion of this assembly. Alright, so a quick look at the setup of the F-22 Raptor. Because the CG on this plane is a little nose heavy at 175 millimeters, instead of adding lead to the tail to compensate for the CG, I decided to just use smaller, lighter packs up front. So this is a 2200 milliamp LiPo that's going to power up the ECU for the turbine, and it only weighs 4.6 ounces. And then I have two lithium ion 3000 milliamp packs for the receiver, for the servos, and then one for the retracts and the brakes. Now moving on to the component tray here, a little further aft. Notice how it's very clean up top. I don't have a whole lot of components set up on the top tray, and that's because the BEC is mounted below this deck on this corner, and then right here is where the ECU is located. Now the reason why I did that is that after maiden, if I do need to shift the CG back even further, now I have the option of placing the receiver packs here, and to just kind of, change the CG a little bit if I need to after initial flight of this jet. So for a little bit further, I'm using a PBR 9D receiver by Powerbox, and I am using the junction box for most of the control surfaces, such as the aileron, the rudder, and the flaps. The only thing that I am not running on the junction box is the elevators, which I have the Powerbox micro match so that I can match the elevators perfectly for both up and down deflections. A little bit further back, we got our JP Hobby retract here with the gear door sequencer and the brakes installed, and then right behind that is the fuel pump for the turbine, and then we got our on and off valve, and right below that is the fuel filter. So moving on to the tail section of the aircraft, where I can show you guys the turbine. So looking at the turbine component, here we got the Swim 180 installed on this jet and pretty much ready to go. We just need to prime the fuel lines and then get this thing fired up for the first time tomorrow when we take this plane out for its maiden flight. Okay, so there you have it, the complete assembly of the new AF Model F-22 Raptor, brought to you by BananaHobby.com. So I just want to give you guys a closer look at how the jet looks like when it's fully assembled. So take a look at those navigation lights on the top and also on the bottom side of the wing. And then you also got your landing lights on your nose wheel as well. Now let's talk about the control throws of this jet. As far as ailerons, it's 25 millimeters of deflection on both sides, and then your elevator at 18 millimeters. Your rudder is going to be at 30 millimeters of deflection on both sides. And then as far as your flaps, there is only one setting that they included in the manual, which is 50 millimeters of down deflection for landing, but I did incorporate a takeoff setup for this jet, which is set at 25 millimeters, and then you get 50 for landing for full flaps. Now as far as CG per manual, it's calling for 175 millimeters from the leading edge back. I did set the CG for this model at 180 millimeters, just to kind of shift the CG back just a little bit, because it is has been flying a little nose heavy from what the customers out there who are flying this model currently is reporting. So I'm setting mine at 180 millimeters back from the leading edge, and then shift that back if I need to after the maiden flight. So that's pretty much it for the assembly of this F-22 Raptor. I'll see you guys on the runway for the maiden flight footage.